Welcome to Learning React with me. In the last few videos, we have seen the mounting and updating phases in the life cycle of a component. In this video, let's talk about the last phase, which is unmounting. This phase in the life cycle has one method called componentWillUnmount. This method will allow us to perform cleanup activities such as removing the subscriptions, removing the timers, cancelling network requests, and many more. So let's see how this code works. In this example, I'm going to create a component called counter. When the component mounts, it will start a timer which will increment the count value every 1 second. And on component unmount, it will invalidate the timer. So let's get started. I have already created a component called counter. So let's add a state to this counter component. So let me create a constructor, call this super method, and I will have a state with a property counter initialized to 0. And then let me create a method to increment the counter. This dot state, and the counter value will be this dot state dot counter plus 1. So we have this increment method. Since this is using the this keyword, let's bind it. This dot increment equals this dot increment dot bind of this. And we have already covered these concepts, why we are calling this super method and why are we binding this keyword in our previous videos. Please check them out if you missed them. And now let me actually create the render method first. So here I will have a simple div that would display the counter value. So let me create a div, and this will have this dot state dot counter value. This should be round bracket. So this is our state value, and now let's create component did mount. So this method will be called whenever the counter component is rendered onto the UI. So in this method, first let me console log to see if the method is called or not mounted. And here let's take a global variable called timer, and this will have the ID returned by the setInterval method. Inside the setInterval method, we want to increment the value of the counter. So I will simply call this dot increment method, which we have created initially. Here we are setting the counter value to the previous counter value plus 1. So this dot increment, and this should be updated every 1 second. So we give it 1000 seconds here, 1000 milliseconds here. Okay, I missed an arrow. So this is the component did mount, where we are creating a set interval and storing the timer ID here. Actually, let's move this from here to here so that I can display the timer ID. This dot timer will now have the ID of the set interval. Let me also create component will unmount, where first let me display the timer. Okay, I will clear the timer whatever interval we have set using this clear interval, which will take the ID of the interval that we want to cancel. So this is the ID, this dot timer. Okay, so we have the counter component ready, and I am calling this counter component like this, where I am creating a state with a boolean variable called start, which is set to false. And I have a method called toggle timer where I am updating the state of the start variable from false to true and true to false every time I click on this button. So this button will have a text called start timer or end timer based on the value of the start property. So if the start state is false, that means I haven't started the timer yet. So when it is false, I have to show the message called start timer. And when it is true, that means the timer has already started and it's running. We need to end it. So this is the message you will be seeing on the button. And based on this value, I am rendering the counter method. When the start value gets value of true, the counter component will be mounted, and when it becomes false, the counter component will be unmounted. And since we are using the this keyword, I am binding this keyword to this toggle timer method in our constructor. So let's see how this component looks on the UI. So this is how our component looks. Let me just clear it. So I have opened the inspect as well. When I click on start timer, you see mounted, and the ID of the timer is 1, and the counter starts incrementing every 1 second. Now when I click on the end timer, okay, I think I have copied and forgot to update. This should be unmounted. Let me clear the console, start the timer, it's mounted. Now the ID of the timer is 4, and I'll click on the end timer, and the timer with this ID is cleared and the component is unmounted, and therefore we don't see any counter here. Again, when I start the counter, it will initialize another ID to the interval, and now it is unmounted. So component will unmount is a very useful method which will improve the performance by clearing unnecessary, by releasing unused memory while you are switching between different components. So this is a simple example where we started a timer and ended the timer on component unmount. I hope you understood this concept, and if you like this content, please like, share and subscribe to InterviewPro. Thank you.